Blue flashing lights reflect off the rain-slicked pavement of a lonely Chevron station. Two overly eager patrolmen slam a quiet, unassuming black man against the hood of a cruiser, ignoring his calm demeanor. They think they've bagged a common street criminal. They have no idea they just handcuffed their worst nightmare. Midnight rain drummed a relentless rhythm against the steel canopy of the Chevron station on Route 4. Arthur Hoyer stood near the rear quarter panel of his meticulously restored 1978 Ford F-150, watching the gas meter tick upward. At 62 years old, Arthur appreciated the quiet of the late night. He wore a faded, oversized Georgetown University sweatshirt, gray sweatpants, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. After a grueling 14-hour day buried in case files, legal briefs, and the heavy burden of consequence, this simple, solitary act of fueling his truck was the only peace he could find. He didn't look like a man who held the fate of hundreds in his hands. He looked like an exhausted grandfather making a late-night run for milk. And in the eyes of the law that was rapidly approaching, that was exactly his crime. The screech of wet tires broke the midnight silence. A city patrol cruiser swung into the gas station lot with unnecessary aggression, its high beams illuminating the mist and blinding Arthur for a fraction of a second. The car jerked to a halt right behind Arthur's Ford, effectively boxing him in. The doors popped open simultaneously. Out stepped Officer Brad Jenkins, a heavy-set man in his late 20s with a high and tight haircut and a chip on his shoulder the size of a cinder block. From the passenger side emerged Officer Thomas Callahan, older, leaner, and chewing aggressively on a piece of gum. They did not approach with the measured caution of public servants. They moved with the predatory swagger of men looking for a reason to escalate. "Step away from the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them," Jenkins barked, his hand resting heavily on the butt of his sidearm. Arthur slowly turned, his expression carefully neutral. His hands, bearing only the calluses of age and the ink stains of a fountain pen, remained visible by his sides. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that naturally commanded quiet rooms, though tonight. He kept the volume perfectly conversational. "I said step away from the truck," Jenkins snapped, closing the distance rapidly. "You deaf, old man?" "I am listening to you," Arthur replied, taking one deliberate step back from the pump. "I'm simply asking for the reason behind this interaction. Am I suspected of a crime?" Callahan scoffed, walking around the other side of the truck, shining his heavy Maglite flashlight into the empty cab. "We've got reports of a suspect matching your description breaking into vehicles in this sector. Tall, black male, wearing a hoodie." Arthur almost sighed. It was the oldest, most legally porous excuse in the book. A generic description broad enough to catch half the city, weaponized to justify a fishing expedition. Terry v. Ohio allowed for a brief investigative stop based on reasonable, articulable suspicion, but this was a blatant stretch. Still, Arthur remained perfectly composed. He knew better than to argue constitutional law on wet asphalt at midnight. That was what courtrooms were for. "I assure you, I've been nowhere near any break-ins," Arthur said smoothly. "I live 3 miles from here. I'm just getting gas." "Let's see some ID," Jenkins demanded, thrusting his hand out. "My wallet is in the center console of my truck," Arthur stated. "If I reach for it, you might misinterpret my movement. I would prefer." "I'm not asking. I'm telling," Jenkins interrupted, his voice spiking in volume. Before Arthur could finish his sentence, Jenkins closed the gap, grabbed Arthur violently by the shoulder, and spun him around, slamming his chest against the cold, wet side of the Ford. The impact knocked the breath from Arthur's lungs. A sharp pain shot up his shoulder, but a colder, far more dangerous anger settled into his mind. "Spread your legs!" Callahan yelled, suddenly beside him, kicking Arthur's ankles apart roughly. "This level of force is entirely unprovoked," Arthur stated, his voice muffled against the metal of his truck, but remarkably steady. He was cataloging every single procedural violation, every violation of department policy, every constitutional breach. He was a walking court reporter, and they were giving him a master class in civil rights violations. "Shut your mouth," Jenkins growled, patting Arthur down with aggressive, invasive sweeps. You people always have something to say. You think you know the law better than we do? If the situation hadn't been so physically degrading, Arthur might have laughed at the bitter irony of that question. Yes, he thought, I do. I write the precedent you continuously fail to uphold. I am complying, Arthur said calmly, but I will note that you are detaining me without probable cause and escalating a consensual encounter into an arrest without justification. Oh, we got a lawyer here, Tommy, Jenkins sneered, yanking Arthur's arms behind his back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit brutally into Arthur's wrists. Jenkins clicked them closed, tight enough to restrict circulation. You're under arrest for failure to identify and resisting a lawful order. Resisting? Arthur repeated softly. I haven't moved a muscle against you. I say you resisted, so you resisted, Jenkins whispered directly into Arthur's ear, a toxic smell of stale coffee and stale bravado. Welcome to the system, old man. Arthur Hoyer, a man who had spent 3 decades sending violent criminals to prison, upholding the delicate fabric of society, and serving as the chief presiding judge of the county superior court, was shoved into the back of a police cruiser like a dog. As the plastic seat dug into his back, he made a conscious, strategic decision. He wasn't going to pull his badge. He wasn't going to shout his name or demand to see their captain. He was going to let them hang themselves. He was going to ride this out and see exactly what kind of rot was festering in the dark corners of the city's police department when they thought nobody of consequence was watching. The ride to the precinct was a symphony of unprofessionalism. Sitting in the dark, caged back seat, Arthur listened as Jenkins and Callahan celebrated their minor victory. Easy collar, Callahan chuckled from the passenger seat, tapping away on the mobile data terminal. Guy's got no priors. Clean record under the name Arthur. Probably just some retired nobody. We'll let him rot in holding until morning. Teach him some respect for the badge. Good, Jenkins replied, accelerating too hard off a red light. I need an easy night anyway. We've got that huge testimony tomorrow morning in Superior Court. State v. Henderson. We nail this. We're definitely getting those plainclothes detective shields. Arthur's eyes opened in the dark. State v. Henderson. It was a major narcotics trafficking case. It had been on his docket for 6 months. He was the presiding judge. Jenkins and Callahan were the primary arresting officers and the state's star witnesses. If their testimony fell apart, the state's entire case against a major cartel distributor would crumble. A cold, judicial smile touched the corners of Arthur's mouth, hidden by the shadows of the cruiser. Karma, it seemed, was not just real. She was a punctual employee of the state justice system. Central booking was a chaotic, fluorescent-lit purgatory smelling of bleach, cheap sweat, and stale alcohol. Arthur was dragged out of the cruiser, processed by an exhausted and indifferent booking clerk who didn't even look at him, and stripped of his belt, shoelaces, and the contents of his pockets. His wallet, containing his judicial credentials, was unceremoniously dumped into a brown manila envelope, sealed without a second glance. He was thrown into holding cell 4, alongside a snoring drunk and a jittery teenager. The steel door clanged shut, a sound Arthur had heard described countless times from the bench, but had never truly felt reverberate in his own chest. He sat on the cold concrete bench. He didn't sleep. He sat in perfect, terrifying silence, mentally drafting the most explosive motion to dismiss in the history of the county. At 4:30 a.m., the shift change occurred. The chaotic night crew, including Jenkins and Callahan, clocked out, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb they had left in the basement. They went home to sleep for a few hours before putting on their best suits for court. Upstairs, Desk Sergeant William O'Malley, a 30-year veteran of the force who had seen everything, poured his first cup of black coffee and sat down to review the night's arrest logs. He adjusted his reading glasses, flipping through the sloppy paperwork left by Jenkins. Suspect, Arthur Hoyer. Charge, resisting arrest, failure to identify. O'Malley frowned. The name was familiar, too familiar. He clicked his mouse, pulling up the booking photo taken 3 hours earlier, The man staring back from the monitor wasn't a standard street vagrant. The face was older, tired, and deeply displeased, but the sharp, intelligent eyes were unmistakable. O'Malley had testified in front of those eyes a dozen times. He had seen those eyes peer over reading glasses from a mahogany bench, handing down life sentences. The blood drained entirely from Sergeant O'Malley's face. The coffee cup slipped from his trembling hand, shattering on the linoleum floor and splashing brown liquid across his polished boots. "Mother of God," O'Malley whispered, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. He slammed his hand onto the dispatch radio. "Get the watch commander out here, right now, and somebody get the chief on the phone. Wake him up." Panic, raw and unfiltered, descended upon the precinct. Within 20 minutes, the chief of police, a man named Robert Hayes, arrived in sweatpants and a windbreaker, looking as pale as a ghost. He descended the stairs to the holding cells alongside a frantic O'Malley and a terrified watch commander. The heavy steel door of cell 4 was practically ripped open. Arthur Hoyer was sitting exactly where they had left him, his hands resting patiently on his knees. He looked up at the three men staring at him in sheer terror. "Judge Hoyer," Chief Hayes choked out, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I don't even know what to say. There has been a catastrophic mistake." Arthur stood up slowly. His joints ached from the cold concrete, but his posture was straight as a steel rod. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. His silence was infinitely more intimidating. "A mistake implies a deviation from standard procedure, Chief Hayes," Arthur said smoothly, his baritone echoing in the quiet block. "What I experienced tonight was not a mistake. It was a well-practiced, routine execution of excessive force, illegal search, and false imprisonment by 2 of your officers. We are dropping all charges immediately." "Your Honor," the chief stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Complete expungement. We will handle Jenkins and Callahan internally, I promise you. Suspensions, desk duty, whatever you think is appropriate." Arthur stepped out of the cell. An officer rushed forward with his brown manila envelope, holding it out like an offering to a wrathful deity. Arthur took it, pulling out his wallet and his keys. "You won't handle them internally, Robert," Arthur said, securing his watch onto his wrist, "because internal discipline is a secret, and what happened tonight needs to be brought into the light." "Your Honor, please," the chief pleaded. "The press." "I don't care about the press," Arthur interrupted, walking toward the exit. He paused at the door and looked back at the terrified brass. "Those 2 officers bragged to me that they are the star witnesses in State v. Henderson this morning, a trial over which I am presiding." The chief's jaw dropped. The implications washed over him like ice water. "Have them in my courtroom at 9 a.m. sharp," Arthur commanded softly. "Do not tell them what happened here. Do not tell them who I am. Let them walk into that courtroom exactly as they are." Without waiting for an answer, Judge Arthur Hoyer pushed through the heavy double doors and walked out into the breaking dawn. He had a shower to take, a robe to put on, and an absolute reckoning to deliver. Morning sunlight filtered through the towering, arched windows of the highly polished mahogany chambers of the County Superior Court. Judge Arthur Hoyer stood before a full-length mirror, meticulously tying his necktie. The physical remnants of the night before were subtly present, a dull, throbbing ache in his right shoulder where Jenkins had slammed him against the truck, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from sleeping a mere 2 hours in his own bed after leaving the precinct. But mentally, Arthur had never been sharper. The cold anger that had sustained him in the holding cell had crystallized into a diamond-hard judicial focus. He reached for his black robe, pulling the heavy fabric over his shoulders. It was more than a uniform. It was the physical manifestation of the law itself. It was armor. Today, he would wield the authority it represented with absolute, surgical precision. Out in the bustling third-floor hallway, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to Arthur's quiet chambers. The courthouse was a beehive of nervous energy, plea deals being whispered in corners, and lawyers dragging rolling briefcases over the terrazzo floors. Near the heavy double doors of courtroom 302, officers Brad Jenkins and Thomas Callahan leaned against the marble wall, exuding an aura of untouchable arrogance. They had traded their damp, rain-soaked patrol uniforms for cheap, off-the-rack suits that didn't quite fit their broad shoulders. Jenkins was aggressively adjusting his collar, while Callahan methodically snapped a fresh piece of peppermint gum. "I'm telling you, Tommy, we're golden," Jenkins muttered, checking his reflection in the glass of a fire extinguisher cabinet. "We nail this testimony. Henderson goes away for 20 to life, and the captain has to give us that plainclothes detail. It's a lock." Callahan chuckled, folding his arms. "Just as long as Montgomery doesn't botch the direct examination. She gets flustered when defense attorneys start yelling." He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, you think that old guy from the Chevron is still rotting and holding?" "Who cares?" Jenkins scoffed, completely devoid of empathy. "Probably crying for his public defender by now. Desk sergeant will process him out by noon with a court date he'll never show up for. Serves him right for giving me attitude. You don't talk back to the badge." Assistant District Attorney Sarah Montgomery, a sharp, fiercely ambitious prosecutor in her early 30s, marched down the hallway toward them. She carried a thick accordion file bursting with transcripts and evidence logs. Her entire career trajectory was currently riding on State v. Henderson, a massive narcotics trafficking syndicate she had spent 2 years building a case against. Jenkins, Callahan, Sarah clipped, not bothering with pleasantries. "Listen up. The defense attorney is William Gable. He's a shark. He is going to come after your credibility regarding the initial traffic stop that led to the seizure of the fentanyl in Henderson's trunk. He's going to say you profiled him, that you had no probable cause, and that you fabricated the erratic driving to justify the search." "Let him try," Jenkins said, puffing out his chest. "Our paperwork is bulletproof, counselor. We saw him cross the double yellow line. Twice. We smelled the unburned narcotics upon approaching the vehicle." "It's textbook." "It better be," Sarah warned, her eyes narrowing. "If your testimony wavers, if Gable catches you in a lie or a procedural inconsistency, Judge Hoyer will toss the evidence faster than you can blink. Hoyer is an absolute constitutional purist. He doesn't suffer fools, and he despises dirty cops. You play this perfectly straight, by the book. Understood?" "Relax, Sarah," Callahan said, offering a patronizing smile. "We know how to testify. We're the good guys, remember?" Unbeknownst to the trio, a fourth man had quietly taken a seat on the wooden benches in the very back row of the gallery inside courtroom 302. Chief of Police Robert Hayes sat hunched forward, his face buried in his hands. He had not slept. He had not changed out of his windbreaker. He looked like a man waiting for a terminal diagnosis. He had debated calling ADA Montgomery to warn her, to pull the officers, to completely dismiss the Henderson case to avoid the impending slaughter. But Judge Hoyer's final command had been absolute. Do not tell them. Let them walk into that courtroom exactly as they are. Hayes knew that disobeying Arthur Hoyer on this matter would not just end his career. It would result in a federal Department of Justice probe into his entire department. He was forced to sit and watch the train derail in slow motion. At exactly 8:58 a.m., Jenkins and Callahan swaggered through the swinging wooden gates, taking their seats in the front row directly behind the prosecution's table. They whispered jokes to each other, completely blind to the fact that the room was about to become their professional graveyard. "All rise." The sharp, booming voice of the bailiff cut through the low murmur of the courtroom. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. Every person in the room, the prosecutors, the high-priced defense attorneys, the heavily tattooed defendant Hector Henderson, and the gallery of law students and reporters stood in unison. Judge Arthur Hoyer ascended the 3 steps to the bench. He moved with a deliberate, commanding grace. He placed his thick leather-bound notebook on the polished wood, adjusted the microphone, and finally looked up to survey his courtroom. In the front row, Officer Brad Jenkins, in the middle of a whispered joke, casually glanced up at the bench. The punchline died in his throat. The air in the room suddenly felt as thick as wet concrete. Jenkins blinked. Once, twice. His brain simply refused to process the visual information being sent through his optic nerves. He looked at the high cheekbones, the silver hair at the temples, the dark, piercing eyes that were currently sweeping across the room. It was the old man from the Chevron station, the man he had slammed against a Ford F-150, the man he had illegally searched, handcuffed, and tossed into the back of a cruiser, the man he had mocked in a cold holding cell just 8 hours prior. Jenkins' hands gripped the wooden railing in front of him so hard his knuckles turned a violent shade of white. A cold sweat instantly broke out across his forehead, and a wave of severe nausea hit his stomach. He felt the blood abandon his extremities, rushing to his vital organs in a primal fight-or-flight response. Beside him, Callahan noticed his partner's rigid posture. "Brad, you good man? You look like you're gonna puke." Callahan followed Jenkins' terrified, unblinking gaze up to the bench. Callahan's jaw unhinged. The peppermint gum slipped from his tongue, falling onto his lap. A low, strangled sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, escaped Callahan's throat. Judge Hoyer's eyes finally rested on the two officers. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked at them with the cold, detached appraisal of a scientist examining a particularly vile species of insect under a microscope. He held their gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds. In those 3 seconds, an entire conversation occurred without a single word being spoken. "I told you," the judge's eyes communicated. "I told you that you were violating my rights. And now, you belong to me." "Be seated," Judge Hoyer announced, his resonant voice filling the cavernous room. Jenkins fell into his chair, his legs suddenly lacking the bone density to support his weight. He was trembling, visibly, violently trembling. Calling the matter of the state of California versus Hector Henderson, Hoyer read from the docket, his tone perfectly even. "Are the parties ready to proceed with the suppression hearing?" "The state is ready, Your Honor," Ada Montgomery announced confidently, standing tall. "The defense is ready, Your Honor," William Gable echoed from the other table. "Very well. The state may call its first witness," Hoyer instructed, leaning back in his high-backed leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "The state calls Officer Bradley Jenkins to the stand," Montgomery said. Jenkins didn't move. He was paralyzed, staring straight ahead at the seal of the state mounted on the wall behind the judge. "Officer Jenkins?" Montgomery prompted, turning around. She frowned, noticing his pale, sweating face. "Officer Jenkins, please take the stand." Callahan aggressively elbowed his partner in the ribs. Jenkins jolted, stumbling to his feet. He walked toward the witness box like a man walking the Green Mile. His steps were heavy, uncoordinated. He nearly tripped on the single wooden step leading up to the chair. The bailiff approached. "Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Jenkins looked at the bailiff, then slowly dragged his eyes up to meet Judge Hoyer's unwavering stare. Hoyer sat merely 3 feet away, an imposing monolith of black robes and impending doom. I fanned, I do," Jenkins choked out, his voice a frail, cracking shadow of the booming bark he had used the night before. He sat down. He felt like he couldn't draw enough oxygen into his lungs. "Officer Jenkins," Montgomery began, approaching the podium. "Could you please state your name and badge number for the record?" "Bradley Jenkins, badge number 8,442. He had to look at his own chest to remember his number. Montgomery's brow furrowed. This was not the arrogant, rock-solid witness she had prepped. "Officer Jenkins, I want to direct your attention to the night of October 14th. Were you on active patrol in the downtown sector?" "Yes," Jenkins whispered. "You'll have to speak into the microphone, officer. The court reporter cannot hear you," Judge Hoyer interrupted. His voice was polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying to the man on the stand. "Yes, I was on patrol," Jenkins repeated loudly, flinching at the sound of his own amplified voice. Montgomery spent the next 20 minutes walking Jenkins through the traffic stop of Hector Henderson. It was excruciating. Jenkins stumbled over his own words, contradicted his own police report twice, and continually wiped sweat from his face with a trembling hand. He could not stop glancing at the judge. Every time he did, Hoyer was there, watching, waiting, taking meticulous notes with a silver fountain pen, and it was at this point, Officer Jenkins, that you observed the defendant's vehicle cross the double yellow line? Montgomery asked, trying to guide him back to the script. Yes. No. Yes, he crossed the line. Once. Maybe twice, Jenkins stammered. William Gable, the defense attorney, was practically salivating at his table. He didn't know why the state's star witness was having a nervous breakdown, but he was fully prepared to exploit it. Thank you, officer. Nothing further, Montgomery said, sitting down with a heavy sigh of frustration. She knew the testimony was weak, but she hoped the physical evidence would carry the day. Mr. Gable, your witness, Judge Hoyer announced. Gable stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Officer Jenkins, you just testified that you clearly saw my client cross the center line, but in your initial report, filed at 3 a.m. that night, you wrote that you initiated the stop due to a defective taillight. Which is it? It was both. Jenkins lied, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. The taillight was out, and then he swerved. I see, Gable said smoothly. Officer Jenkins, is it fair to say that accuracy and truthfulness in police reports are paramount to your duties as a sworn officer of the law? Yes. And you take that oath to tell the truth very seriously? Yes. Have you ever, in your career, falsified a police report to justify a stop or an arrest? Gable asked. Standard cross-examination boilerplate to establish credibility. Jenkins swallowed hard. No. Gable opened his mouth to ask the next question, but a sound stopped him. Tap, tap, tap. Judge Hoyer was lightly tapping the butt of his fountain pen against the heavy mahogany wood of the bench. The rhythmic sound echoed like a judge's gavel in a death penalty case. Silence descended upon the courtroom. Hoyer slowly turned his head to face the witness box. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the bench, bringing his face closer to the trembling officer. Officer Jenkins. Judge Hoyer began, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made the hair on the back of ADA Montgomery's neck stand up. You are currently under oath. You understand the penalty for perjury in this state? Yes, Your Honor, Jenkins croaked. Mr. Gable just asked you if you have ever falsified a police report or fabricated probable cause to justify a stop or an arrest. You answered, no. Hoyer paused, letting the silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. I am going to afford you the opportunity to reconsider that answer. Carefully. Montgomery jumped to her feet. Objection, Your Honor? The witness has already answered the question. The court is badgering the witness. Overruled, counselor. Sit down, Hoyer snapped, not breaking eye contact with Jenkins. The sheer authority in his voice forced Montgomery back into her chair instantly. Let me rephrase the question for the sake of clarity. Officer Jenkins, Hoyer continued, his tone dangerously calm. Is it your standard operating procedure to approach citizens who are engaging in lawful, constitutionally protected activities, detain them without reasonable, articulable suspicion, physically assault them without provocation, and then draft an official police report charging them with resisting arrest to cover up your own gross misconduct? The courtroom erupted in a low murmur of shock. Gable looked utterly bewildered. Montgomery's jaw dropped. In the back row, Chief Hayes let out a quiet sob. Jenkins was having a full-blown panic attack on the stand. His chest heaved. Your Honor, I plead the Fifth. You cannot selectively invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege after already answering the question on direct examination. Officer, Hoyer fired back, his voice rising, filling the room with the wrath of a betrayed justice system. I will ask you again, and you will answer me. Did you, or did you not, falsify a police report regarding an arrest made at a Chevron gas station on Route 4 at approximately 12:15 a.m. this very morning? It was a mistake, Jenkins blurted out, tears of sheer terror welling in his eyes. We thought, you matched a description. We were just doing our jobs. The admission hung in the air like a detonation. You were doing your jobs? Hoyer repeated, his voice laced with absolute acidic contempt. He turned his gaze to the gallery. Officer Callahan, stand up! Callahan, sitting in the front row, shot to his feet as if he had been electrocuted, his face the color of old parchment. Are you the partner who proudly proclaimed, "I say you resisted, so you resisted," while Officer Jenkins applied handcuffs to a compliant citizen? Hoyer demanded, the full story finally unspooling in open court. Your Honor, please, Callahan begged, his hands raised in surrender. Hoyer slammed his hand flat against the bench. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Answer the question, officer. Yes, Your Honor, that was me. Callahan openly wept in the gallery, the tough guy facade entirely shattered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We didn't know who you were. And that, Officer Callahan, is precisely the point, Judge Hoyer said, his voice suddenly dropping to a low, deadly whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. You didn't know who I was. You thought I was nobody. You thought I was someone who had no voice, no power, and no recourse against your abuse of authority. You acted not out of a commitment to the law, but out of the cowardice of bullies who operate in the dark. Hoyer turned his attention back to Ada Montgomery, who was staring at her 2-star witnesses with a mixture of profound horror and absolute disgust. Her 2-year narcotics investigation had just been incinerated in front of her eyes. Counselor Montgomery, Hoyer addressed her. The state's case relies entirely on the sworn testimony of Officers Jenkins and Callahan regarding the establishment of probable cause to search Mr. Henderson's vehicle. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Montgomery whispered, knowing exactly what was coming. This court finds that Officers Jenkins and Callahan have openly admitted, on the record, to systemic perjury, excessive force, and the fabrication of official police documents, Hoyer declared, his voice ringing with finality. Their credibility is not merely compromised, it is non-existent. The court cannot and will not accept a single syllable of their testimony as fact. Judge Hoyer picked up his fountain pen and opened the case file. The defense's motion to suppress all evidence gathered during the illegal traffic stop of Hector Henderson is hereby granted. The state is left with no admissible evidence. Case dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Henderson, you are free to go. Hector Henderson, a known cartel affiliate, blinked in disbelief, then smiled a predatory smile at the 2 weeping officers. He stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man, entirely because 2 dirty cops couldn't contain their arrogance at a gas station. The irony was suffocating. Furthermore, Hoyer continued, ignoring the departing defendant and staring down the officers, I am ordering the court reporter to forward the immediate, unedited transcript of this proceeding directly to the District Attorney's Office, the Internal Affairs Division, and the State Attorney General. Officers Jenkins and Callahan, you are hereby remanded into the custody of the bailiff, pending an immediate investigation into federal civil rights violations and perjury. Bailiff, Hoyer commanded, his eyes blazing with the cold fire of absolute justice. Take them into custody. Cuff them. The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute, broken only by the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of Bailiff Harrison approaching the witness stand. The air, previously thick with the officers' arrogance, now suffocated them with the crushing weight of inevitable consequence. Stand up, Officer Jenkins, Bailiff Harrison commanded. His voice held no sympathy, only the stern detachment of a man doing his duty. Jenkins stood, his legs trembling so violently he had to grip the wooden railing to stay upright. The bespoke suit he had worn to impress the court now looked like a cheap costume. He slowly turned around, placing his hands behind his back. The metallic click, click, click of the handcuffs, locking around Jenkins' wrists, echoed through the cavernous room. It was the exact same sound, the exact same restrictive bite of cold steel that Arthur Hoyer had endured against the rain-slicked side of his Ford F-150 just hours prior. Officer Callahan, step forward and present your hands, Harrison ordered, moving toward the gallery. Callahan did not resist. He couldn't. He offered his wrists like a defeated prisoner of war, hot tears streaming down his face, ruining his meticulously groomed appearance. The swagger was gone, replaced by the pathetic realization that his career, his freedom, and his entire identity had been incinerated in a span of 10 minutes. Judge Arthur Hoyer watched the procedure from the elevated bench, his expression an unreadable mask of judicial stoicism. He found no joy in this. There was no triumphant smirk, no gloating. There was only a profound, heavy sorrow for the uniform these men had disgraced. "Chief Hayes." Hoyer's baritone voice suddenly cut through the tension. He was looking directly at the back row of the gallery, where the chief of police sat frozen in horror. "Approach the bench." Chief Robert Hayes stood up on shaky legs. He walked down the center aisle, past the stunned prosecutors, and the empty defense table where Hector Henderson had sat just moments before. He stopped before the elevated mahogany desk, looking up at the judge like a man awaiting the guillotine. "Your Honor," Hayes choked out. "Take their badges, Robert," Hoyer commanded quietly. "Take their sidearms, right here, right now. They will not walk out of this courtroom bearing the seal of this city." Hayes nodded weakly. He turned to the two handcuffed men, who were once his promising officers. With trembling hands, the chief reached inside Jenkins' suit jacket, unclipped the silver shield, and pulled the service weapon from its holster. He repeated the agonizing process with Callahan. The distinct clatter of the heavy metal badges and firearms being placed onto the prosecution's table sounded like the final nails being driven into a coffin. "What happened last night at that Chevron station was not an anomaly, Chief Hayes," Hoyer said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 gavels. "It was the symptom of a disease that has taken root in your department, a culture of impunity that thrives in the dark, preying on those they believe are voiceless. Today, the lights came on. I swear to you, Arthur, Your Honor, I will tear the department down to the studs if I have to," Hayes pleaded, his voice cracking. "We will root this out." "You will have help," Hoyer replied coldly. "Because I am formally requesting the Department of Justice to open a sweeping civil rights probe into the midnight patrol divisions of this precinct. You are going to open your books, your dash cams, and your internal affairs files to the federal government. Every arrest these two men have made in the last 5 years will be audited. Every conviction that relied solely on their word will be reviewed." Assistant District Attorney Sarah Montgomery, still reeling from the destruction of her 2-year narcotics case, slowly stood up. "Your Honor, regarding the dismissal of State v. Henderson, a dangerous man just walked out of this building." "I am acutely aware of that, Counselor," Hoyer said, locking eyes with the prosecutor, "and it makes me sick to my stomach. But the Constitution is not a suggestion, and the Fourth Amendment is not a technicality. The moment we allow corrupt police officers to manufacture evidence and commit perjury to secure a conviction, we cease to be a nation of laws. We become a police state. Hector Henderson is free today not because the system failed, but because these two officers poisoned the well. Let this be a brutal lesson to your office regarding the witnesses you choose to put on my stand." Hoyer picked up his wooden gavel. "Officers Jenkins and Callahan are remanded to the county jail, to be held without bail pending federal arraignment. This court is in recess." The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a definitive, deafening crack. The fallout was historic. The story leaked to the press before the lunch hour, dominating national headlines by dusk. The judge who arrested his arresters. It became the ultimate real-life cautionary tale. Jenkins and Callahan didn't just lose their jobs. They were indicted by a federal grand jury for deprivation of civil rights under color of law, perjury, and official oppression. Without the protective shield of the badge, they faced hard time in a federal penitentiary. The DOJ investigation ripped through the department, exposing a half-dozen other officers involved in similar civil rights abuses, leading to mass resignations and sweeping systemic reforms. Through it all, Judge Arthur Hoyer remained exactly where he was on the bench, dispensing justice with an even hand, ensuring that the scales remained balanced, no matter who stood before him. The flashing lights at the Chevron station were meant to intimidate, but they illuminated a path to systemic reckoning. Justice is not a shield for the corrupt, but a brutal mirror reflecting their true nature. When those sworn to protect become the predators, the gavel must fall with uncompromising force. True power doesn't reside in a badge or a gun, but in the unwavering courage to uphold the law in the dark.